So in Scottish prisons, there are a range of different kinds of educational opportunities and a range of different forms of rehabilitative activity. So the narrowest form, I would say, of rehabilitation that we use is a kind of cognitive behavioural series of interventions which seek to address very specific needs which have been associated with offending behaviour in the literature, in the research literature. And those are generally called offending behaviour programmes. So they look at a specific kind of offending and they develop a specific treatment process, education process, which tries to help the person explore and address those specific factors linked to that behaviour. So that's a very kind of offence-centred mode of doing rehabilitative activity. But beyond that, in Scottish prisons, there's a certain degree of access to education of all sorts of levels, from basic literacy and numeracy through to university degrees. So we have people in Scottish prisons undertaking open university degrees by distance learning, and lots of different levels of education in between basic foundation literacy right through to a higher education level. And obviously those kinds of interventions contribute to rehabilitation in a different way, just as we all go through educational processes to broaden our minds, develop our skills, improve our employment prospects, enrich our lives. All of those things apply to people in prison as to people outside. And then there's other contexts where education would be happening in a more informal way. So we might think then of sports programs where people are learning teamwork skills or learning about nutrition and diet and health. And similarly, there are a range of arts initiatives in Scottish prisons where people are learning about self-expression, about identity, about their relationships with others, and also in some contexts learning to collaborate and cooperate, for example in a choir or in the development of a theatre performance, or in any of those kinds of ways. And finally, at least the last thing that occurs to me, is more directly vocational forms of training, where people are prepared for a specific kind of role in the labour market. And so I know, for example, in Scottish prisons that one of the most common courses which is run is a course for industrial cleaners. So basically training people to work in industry as cleaners, in warehouses and commercial properties and so on. And I presume that that course is run extensively because there's an identified demand in the labour market for that kind of skill. But obviously, what you would want in a prison system is a good fit between the needs of the labour market and the provision of training, vocational training on the inside. I would add only that in my own view, in a kind of ideal sense, you would want the widest possible range of educational opportunities in prisons, and you would want to take account of the fact that many people in prisons have become alienated from mainstream education through having negative experiences of school and school exclusion. And so if you create for them an environment which looks very much like a school, it may not work very well. Identified specific factors that are correlated with that behaviour. And a group of Canadian researchers have popularised a very specific model of rehabilitation called the risk-need-responsivity model. And the idea is that you provide the intensity of the service that you provide, the kind of, they use the word dosage, sounds a bit too medical for me, but the dosage of treatment that you provide has to match the level of assessed risk. So if somebody has high risk of reoffending, hours of treatment to address the factors that lie behind the offending. And they look at factors like antisocial attitudes and problems with thinking skills. They look at questions in relation to values and what they would call values enhancement, helping people to explore and understand norms and values. They look at issues in relation to substance misuse. To a certain extent, in some contexts, they look at mental health and well-being, although they often don't regard that as a key or core focus of treatment. They look at associates, who people associate with the subcultures that they belong to, and how to help people navigate towards social connections and relationships that are more conducive to compliance with the law. So they've developed programs that use very specific techniques to try to address those very specific factors. In my view, that's too narrow. My own research and my own publications explore in a more holistic way the process of desistance from crime, so how and why people stop offending. And if you look at that, not through the lens of which treatments work, but through the lens of how do we understand and explore the experiences of those who have succeeded in moving beyond crime, then it points us towards the central importance of social relationships, of social ties, of connections to people, family, friends, but also a wider network of acquaintances through which we might secure access to the job market or to educational opportunities. That literature also stresses the importance of motivation and hope, which links in certain respects to questions of self-efficacy and agency, the ability to govern and direct your own life. And crucially, it points to the importance of social capital, so the networks of relationships that we need in order to navigate all of life's transitions, really. So desistance research would suggest that when we're working with people who've been involved in persistent offending, we have to work in and through relationships, and we have to work to try to address their concerns, identify what life it is that they want to lead, and then help them overcome the numerous barriers and obstacles that exist to desistance in contemporary societies. Things like labelling, stigmatisation, social rejection, labour market exclusion, the burden of carrying a criminal record, rejection from communities. There's a whole array of personal and social challenges that people face, and for me that means that it's much more, the task of supporting desistance is much wider than just training people to develop new thinking skills to address their behaviour. In fact, it's not just their behaviour which is important, it's the behaviour of all of us in society, the way that we respond to people returning from prison. What part do we have to play in securing their reintegration? That takes us a little bit beyond education and into other questions.
So how can the prisoners get the access to the re-education or the mental health care?
Well, they can only get access to those services if we decide to provide them.
Oh.
And the key conundrum or problem there is that the more that our prisons become overcrowded, the more problematic it becomes for the prison service to provide those kinds of opportunities.
Yeah.
What happens in overcrowded prison systems is that the kind of regime that is provided is residualized to the bare minimum that's required for safety and security. Obviously, when prison populations go up, if staffing doesn't increase, then everything becomes harder to do. The basic dynamics of unlocking prisoners from their cells and moving them from one place to another to access a course become complicated and difficult if there's not enough prison officers on duty to enable that movement of people. But more broadly, and there's a good example of this in Scotland at the moment, if the prison service is under pressure because of population numbers, then it will deploy its staff on basic duties and thereby cut things like, in Scotland recently, the through care support scheme. So we had a very good scheme where prison officers went out of prisons at the end of the sentence with released prisoners for the first 3 to 6 months to help them navigate a successful return to society. That scheme has been cut because the Chief Executive of the Prison Service says that he needs all hands on deck to manage the basic safety and security of overcrowded Scottish prisons. So actually, in order to provide the range of services that I've just described, we need to minimise our prison population. We need to use prison as sparingly as possible in order to make the experience of imprisonment as productive as we can, within the constraints that imprisonment inevitably imposes on people. So actually, to make imprisonment better, we need to imprison less people.
Yeah.
But you can put that in very simple economic terms. If the budget of the prison service is static, and you have prison numbers declining, then you can spend more per prisoner. If the prison numbers are rising and the budget is static, you don't have resources to expend on education, rehabilitation, training, and so on.
Because I know they can get help from the government or from non-profit organizations.
Yeah, the non-profit organizations do a lot of work in prisons and after prisons, supplementing the kinds of provision that the prison can make itself. But even then, I know this from personal experience, if I work in a third sector organisation, a non-profit organisation, and I'm going into a prison to work with a group, so in my experience, for example, we've done this recently in a programme that focuses on songwriting. I'll not explain why, but we are paying for that, so that it's cost neutral for the prison service. We have the money, we have the resources to bring the musicians and the facilitators and the equipment into the prison to run the session. But the prison staff still have to recruit the participants and get the participants from the cell to the room where we're going to run the course. And we know that when the prison service comes under pressure because of high numbers, their ability to recruit and facilitate us working for free in the prison is diminished. So that's clearly a crazy situation where public resources, even in the non-profit sector, much of the money comes from the government. Public resources are being wasted because imprisonment rates are too high.
In which conditions the non-profit organizations they will stop their help?
Well, they want, obviously non-profit organisations have to find funding too, and that's been very difficult for many of those organisations with the UK government's austerity programme after the financial crisis of 2008. So the people that run those organisations are constantly chasing funding from different bodies, charitable trusts, from the government, sometimes from the prison service itself, to fund their activities. But my point is that even if they secure that funding, making that money work in the prison depends on the resources of the prison service. It's not so, obviously the work that non-profit organisations do on the outside isn't vulnerable to the same dynamic. There, the challenge is that if you have people who have been involved in persistent offending and who have very significant personal and social needs, and they're returning to the community to inadequate housing provision or to inadequate addiction services, and if they're having to wait for a benefits claim for public assistance to be processed, then during that period, that initial sort of month or 6 weeks post-release, it's very easy to lose those people. People give up and return to substance misuse, or they give up and return to offending because they have no other available means of subsistence. And the third sector organisations try to catch and hold that population. But a third sector organisation doesn't typically have housing to offer, so it can't meet a very basic need. And we have a big problem in Scotland with inadequate provision of social housing. So that creates a major barrier to successful re-entry. So it's a kind of, think of it as a network of services that are interdependent, and when one aspect of what's required isn't available or collapses, the dominoes fall for others too. So there's a problem there of coordination and of kind of coherent, coordinated investment by the state, both through state organisations and through non-profit organisations, to make comprehensive provision available for people so that their return to the community is navigable, safely navigable.
About psychological rehabilitations,
Yeah.
how does it work?
So that, when I've been talking about the risk-need responsivity model in my previous answers and the offending behaviour programmes, that is where most prison-based psychologists in the UK are working primarily through those programmes to try to address social and psychological factors that lie behind offending. There are other things that psychologists do. So there are also clinical psychologists. So forensic psychologists tend to work on those programs, and forensic psychologists are essentially psychologists who are focused on addressing offending behaviour. Clinical psychologists are concerned with all aspects of the mental health and well-being of people. And one thing that we need to remember about people in prison is that they have the full range of health needs, physical and mental health needs.
Yeah.
So a forensic psychologist is not the right person to treat depression, for example. So you need psychological provision that responds not just to the offending, but also to the person in a more sort of rounded way. And there is some clinical psychology provision in prisons through the health service to try to help address those kinds of difficulties. There's very little one-to-one work, however. So where, including in the forensic context, where a person's offending has very specific dynamics and drivers, I think it's very difficult to get one-to-one support from a psychologist to address that. It's almost all group-related programmed provision, which is obviously cheaper, but also less individualised than might be required for some people. And psychological provision on the outside in Scotland is not great. We have long waiting lists for psychological support, including for young people in Scotland, which is a major problem at the moment. And forensic psychology provision for the services that supervise people in the community is also quite patchy, quite limited. So yeah, that can be a problem. I think of other forms of psychological treatment. In some jurisdictions, and there may be one or two examples of this in Scotland, there are what's called psychologically informed environments, where people are living in, this is in the context of incarceration, so in prisons or in secure mental hospitals, people are being held in wards or in units that are trying to provide a therapeutic environment, a therapeutic community environment. And in England, there are a number of prisons and mental hospitals that do that, and also some what's called approved premises, which is a kind of probation hostel or a halfway house that you might go to after imprisonment, where they're trying to work in a psychologically informed way. And that includes trying to address and engage with things like trauma, the effects of head injury, cognitive impairment. In other words, not just the forensic focus on offending behaviour, but a more rounded kind of provision.
how community supervision works in Scotland?
Okay, so we have an unusual system in Scotland in that we have no separate probation or parole service. Since the end of the 1960s, beginning of the 1970s, we have integrated all probation and parole functions within social work departments, which are part of local authorities in Scotland, so municipalities. And criminal justice social work, as we call it, is a recognised specialism within those local authority social work departments. And so we train, social workers are trained generically, meaning that they're trained to practice across a whole range of different client groups: children, people with disabilities, older people, people who offend, and so on. Their training is kind of topped up with a little bit of work on criminal justice specifically, and then after they qualify as social workers, they continue in professional development, developing more expertise that's specific to criminal justice. And then they do three main things. One is that they provide reports to the court to guide sentencing decisions. They supervise community sentences, so if the courts impose what's called in Scotland a community payback order, which is a kind of probation order, sometimes involving community service or unpaid work, sometimes involving treatment conditions. There are, I think it's 14 different possible conditions that a judge can choose from to create a community payback order. The social worker then supervises that and works one-to-one with the person on the order. And the third thing that social workers do is supervise people after release, but they only supervise people who have served sentences of 4 years or more at the moment in Scotland. So it's the non-profit organisations that offer support to those that come out of shorter sentences. And again, they're using a social casework approach to assess needs and then provide a range of different kinds of intervention that support people, whether they're supervised on a community sentence or after release. They try to support people to reintegrate into society and to avoid further offending. So that's the way that we do it in Scotland.
So it means that when people stay released from the prison and the government or like the organizations, they will still have focus on the former prisoners.
The long-term prisoners are a focus for social workers. The short-term prisoners are offered help, but they're not obliged to take help from anybody. And a lot of the time the offer comes from the non-profit organisations that try to make contact with people in prison just before release.
How family relationships affect the recidivism?
Yeah, they're hugely important. We know that from research, and we know that imprisonment is often highly destructive of family relationships for very obvious reasons. That damage, if you like, can be mitigated to a certain extent if the prison service adopts policies and practices that encourage and facilitate prison visiting by families. And there have been some good initiatives in that regard in Scotland in recent years. The development of family visit centres just in prisons or on the edge of prisons that have provided slightly more welcoming environments for families, including children. But there's a lot of work still to be done there, and again, this is an area of practice development which suffers because of overcrowding. So family contact officers who in the prison service have specialised in trying to sustain and support those relationships will be being pulled back onto ordinary duties because of high prison numbers. So it's difficult to sustain the right kind of visit arrangements under population pressures. The other thing which is being discussed in Scotland at the moment is using Skype, in-cell Skype, to allow prisoners to have virtual contact with families, to be able to make Skype calls and talk to and see and engage with their families without even leaving their cell. And that's been tried in some jurisdictions with some success, although there's sometimes a risk that it replaces face-to-face contact instead of supplementing it. But we know that that's hugely important, and we know that family relationships are absolutely critical to people on their return from prison, for better or worse. And this is not universally true, but one of the problems of imprisonment is that for many people to survive imprisonment, they narrow their world to the institution. So they try to sort of close out or close off the imagining of life outside because it's too painful to be constantly confronted with what you're missing. And the problem is that dislocates people, both not just spatially, but also emotionally and temporally from their families. So sometimes prisoners talk as if they're in a different time zone, and travelling home is also time travel. But they're coming back to a place that is somewhat familiar, but where children are older, and a lot has changed, and relationships have changed. I know, for example, of examples of prisoners who have returned keen to be good fathers, but if they've left a child at 4 and returned to a child at 14, what's required for parenting a 14-year-old is not what's required for parenting a 4-year-old.